All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm very excited to be welcoming you to the third Shoshana Shier Distinguished Visiting Professors Lecture delivered this year to us by Professor Eddie Breuer. We've been very lucky to have Professor Breuer here as part of our community. He's been around a lot, teaching an undergraduate class, which is getting very rave reviews from our students, being around our graduate students, and of course the faculty. I would say thank you to my colleagues from Jewish Studies who are here. I think you're the most popular Shier professor we had, definitely with faculty. It's very rare to see faculty show up for 3 of the talks, so we're really curious how the story ends. Outlined in the first 2 lectures. Well, you never promised, but now you have to, deliver on that. So by the way, my name is Anna Sternschus, and I'm director of Antennabaum Center for Jewish Studies, those of you who forgot. And I also want to say just a huge thank you to the Shier family and Joseph Shier, especially for supporting this program. It's been going on since 1994, so we're counting. No, it can't be, because 30 years? Oh my God, this is like, right, 30 years. And this is the program established by Joseph's dad, late Milton Shier, and his family to honor Joseph's mom, Shoshana Rose Lillian Shier, who was alumna at U of T, graduating from Woodsworth College in 1973. And I have to say that this program, Shier Professorship, brought really the brightest, the most exciting talent to our university, truly enriched Jewish studies. And if you start looking, not just our community, but also scholarship, broader scholarship in Jewish studies, people who come on this program spend this time researching and writing, publishing work in their field. And if you read the acknowledgement, if they don't forget the acknowledgement, this program, it is actually humbling to think how much Jewish studies as a field got advanced thanks to the time that people got here. We're humbled and excited and very happy that this year we were able to host Professor Breuer here, and we're waiting for the book with the introduction and everything that outlines how important your time here in Toronto was. So that was a hint. That was not a hint, that was a direct instruction. So Professor Breuer is teaching at the Hebrew U, which is from where he is on leave right now to be here. He has been teaching there since 2004 and has written extensively on Moses Mendelssohn, including a volume of translation of his Hebrew writing. And his current long-term project, in collaboration with Marc Brettler, who's a biblical scholar from Duke, is an examination of the Jewish reception of modern critical scholarship on the Bible. So please help me welcome Professor Breuer for his third public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for having me and hosting me. You've all been a wonderful host. Staff gets a special thank you. Natasha gets an extra special thank you for helping me put together this PowerPoint. So let's hope it goes well. When I sent in the titles for the 3 talks, I thought this last talk would be my overview. It's a sense of, I spoke about Spinoza in the first talk. I spoke about this unknown biblical scholar in England, Marcus Kalish, in the second talk. And I thought this was a chance now to give a real, a zoom out overview of how Jews thought about, reflected upon, responded to this thing called biblical criticism. I appreciate that you mentioned that I'm doing this project with Marc Brettler, and that is really important to point out. But after I sent in the titles, at some point I realized, oh my God, what was I thinking? But it was too late already, because however ambitious I am or was, it's impossible actually to do the full overview. So I'm already telling you this will be very much a partial and even a partial kind of overview. I'll spend a few minutes just now explaining to you why this is such a vast project. Marc and I have been working for really, 6, 7 years, and I'm sure this is going to go on for another 5, 6 years. It really is a very long-term project. First of all, the story unfolds on 3 continents. It unfolds in every major and even minor Jewish center. So we're not only talking about Berlin or Jerusalem and New York, but we're talking about Odessa, St. Petersburg, Königsberg, Vienna, Bern in Switzerland, Hoboken, New Jersey. I kid you not, that wasn't a mistake. There's actually someone important there as well. It's a story that unfolds in 3 languages, primarily German, Hebrew, and English, but also in Russian, Italian, French, Hungarian. Of course, I do not command all these languages, and therefore we've had to pull in other scholars and even graduate students to really help us through. It's a story about a range of Jewish thinkers and writers, not only, as you would expect, academics, rabbinic figures, etc., but also laymen. There's a British lawyer named Harold Weiner, who's actually very, very interesting, probably published more than anyone of all the figures we'll deal with, relatively unknown, and there's also educators. Think about, for example, a high school teacher in the Herzliya Gymnasia in Tel Aviv Yafo, who has to think about how am I going to teach Bible to my high school students, and who actually wrote on it. This is in 1910. And I've had to remove him actually from the slideshow. Sorry, Natasha, but after all your good work. It's a story about institutions. It's a story about rabbinic schools in places like Padua, Breslau, Berlin, Budapest, Cincinnati, New York. It's not beyond rabbinical schools. It's a story about, schools of higher Jewish learning, if you will, in Odessa, Philadelphia, and of course, a little place on Mount Scopus called the Hebrew University, and it goes on and on. All of these institutions, and you'll see I will talk about this a little bit later, really have to face the question, how are we going to teach the Bible? And there are fascinating kinds of debates that go on. It's also, by the way, a story of institutions in a negative sense. You have to realize that through the 19th century, at least, Jews could not and were not given positions in Bible in the universities around the world. You could maybe get a position in Semitic languages, but you could not get a position in Bible. That is a 20th century, and it's very important to think about how a field develops, and especially one that primarily has become a very academic kind of field. It's also a story, again, this response to a biblical criticism, it's also a story about books and publications. I'll just say this as briefly as I can. And again, think about it. The Jewish Encyclopedia was a project right at the beginning of the 20th century, an Anglo project, by the way, and became the basis of a Russian encyclopedia, again, at the beginning of the 20th century, which used the Jewish encyclopedia, but added to it as well. In each, if you're publishing an encyclopedia, you have to sort of immediately face the question, what am I going to do with the biblical books? How am I going to present them? Interesting enough, the Jewish Encyclopedia decided that maybe the wisest thing to do is have double entries. So you have a kind of more traditional descriptive one, and then you'd have a more critical one, or one that responded at least to the again, this is not in any way obvious, and editorial boards and editors really had to make these tough decisions. So that's sort of one other aspect of this. It's think about Bible translations. What are you going to translate? Are you going to translate the Masoretic text? Well, by and large, by the way, they did. But when you think about all the dozens of German, English, Russian, Italian, et cetera, translations, again, the editors and the translators needed to make choices. And finally, and certainly not least, there's another issue of translation. Most of the important work on biblical criticism was written in the 19th century and early 20th century in German. So at some point, Hebrew and Yiddish scholars had to think about, should they be translating this into Hebrew and Yiddish? Indeed, they chose to. And we'll talk about that as well. But let's start with beginnings. So for those of you who were at the first lecture and heard my little spiel about Spinoza, I should say that, my sense, and I think those of you who are there would understand that my sense is that the field really begins in the 18th century. Here are 3 of the figures. I could have added the French Jean Astruc. I didn't, but that was just a matter of time. Benjamin Kennicott, Johann David Michaelis, Johann Gottfried Eichhorn. These are really important figures. The first 2, Kennicott and Michaelis, really did important work on the text of the Bible, the Masoretic text, or I should say, pointing out the need for emendations. Michel is also actually wrote on Mosaic law. So this is, I think, where the field really begins. Eichhorn basically comes at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. And he is the one, I think, more than anyone who really does establish the field. And having said that, then we turn to our first figure in terms of the Jewish response to, and that is Moses Mendelssohn. I would be remiss not to at least put up that beautiful picture. I really, there are other paintings. I mean, we could have a whole other lecture on sort of the way in which Mendelssohn is portrayed. What you're looking at there is the title page of his Hebrew, well, it's a German translation and Hebrew commentary to the Pentateuch, to the Chumash. What I want to say, again, in reference to my first talk, again, thank you, Natasha. It works perfectly fine. That's I have to give credit. Just to sort of loop back and point out something about the first talk, if we're already speaking about Moses Mendelssohn. I had said then that Hobbes and Spinoza and others in the 17th century faced this issue of church and state, the issue of the clash of civic authority versus religious authority. And that their approach was essentially to say, no, the way to handle this clash, this ongoing and, in fact, ultimately deadly clashes in many cases, was to restrain the church, to restrain the theologians and the churchmen. And the way that Hobbes and Spinoza sort of thought to do this, among other things, was to undermine or severely reduce the authority of Scripture. Okay? In that context, when you think about Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, Mendelssohn in his book Jerusalem is facing the exact same questions, and he's very much addressing them. But what's different in Mendelssohn is that he addresses these issues without undermining the authority of Scripture. It ends up being something very important when we sort of compare him and understand him where he falls with the others. In fact, his Sefer Netivot HaShalom, this his edition of the Hebrew Bible, very much does the opposite. It's not about undermining the authority of Scripture, it is reinforcing the authority of Scripture. Because what he does, now I should point out that this book, it started before Eichhorn had written his Anleitung, before the important work he had done. So he's mostly responding to people like Kennicott and Michaelis and others who are already giving us lots and lots of evidence of the fact that the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text of the Bible, well, might need emendation. I mean, just to put this as bluntly as I can. Mendelssohn absolutely pushes back. He defends the integrity and authenticity of the Masoretic text. He has a lengthy introduction, the Orlin Tiva, where he argues that the Hebrew Bible has been preserved and accurately preserved and in a trustworthy and authentic way in the language and script in which it was originally recorded. This is his way, by the way, of pushing back against the Samaritan version of the Pentateuch, which had been discovered. And Mendelssohn argues that this is the case down to the vocalization, the nikud, and the accentuation, the ta'amim, that are absolutely integral to the text. The truth is, he mentions Eichhorn once in his introduction, but where he's really pushing back, and this is quite interesting, is the fact that Bible scholars like him often use rabbinic texts as part of their evidence to show various problems in the biblical text. And Mendelssohn, in all cases, tries to show that they have misinterpreted the Midrashic and Talmudic sources. So again, it's an important and interesting step, and of course it really is the first one. He really is the first one to acknowledge and therefore try to respond. This is going to be sort of a path here that I'm not going to pursue very much, but I thought it was worth at least saying that there are two Italians. We're not going to deal very much with the Italians here, Reggio and Luzzatto, both of whom produced their own Chumashim in the 19th century. Okay, Reggio in 1821, Luzzatto a few decades later. What is interesting to note here, they are very conservative. Reggio's Bible is essentially an Italian copy-paste, if you will, almost, of Mendelssohn's Bible. But what's interesting is that on the issue of the Pentateuch, again, they're entirely conservative. But, and this is particularly true with Luzzatto, when it comes to Sifrei Nach, the prophets and the writings, when it comes to everything after the Pentateuch, they actually felt, even though they were cautious, and even though they were very careful and warned about this, but nevertheless, They felt that there was room to amend the books of the prophets and the writings, and someone like Luzzatto did it. So you could suddenly, you see somebody who's saying, well, it can be done and it should be done, however carefully we do it. Okay, I'm going to leave that and proceed to the 19th century. And in the 19th century, there's a series of very, very important German scholars and a series, and you'll see I'm going to now add them one by one, and there's two whose pictures I don't have. And frankly, I could populate this even more. And the effect, in fact, I was looking for was to sort of create a sense of a crowd. Because the first half of the 19th century really sees, I wouldn't say an explosion, that's probably saying it too grandly, but you do see serious biblical scholarship done on the part of these scholars and, frankly, as I said, on the part of other scholars as well. So it creates now a real serious corpus of scholarship. And the question is, well, how are the Jews responding? So my first sort of station will be well, actually, before that, I wanted to add, and I added this later, just again, I think often we have a very linear, even triumphalist sense of how scholarship proceeds, meaning it's all like a straight line. Well, you'll see, we'll talk about Wellhausen, and then a straight line to the Near Eastern Languages department at the University of Toronto or any university. The truth is, even among the Protestants, and by the way, those on my previous slide were all Protestant scholars. Even amongst them, there was dispute, there was tension, and there were fights. And Hengstenberg was actually the important figure in the starting late 20s, 30s, 40s, who tried to push back within the Protestant world and actually succeeded to some degree in trying to sort of hold the tide and argue against this new trend in Bible scholarship. Again, it bears in mind and it'll come up. But when we turn again to my subject, which is how Jews responded, we think, of course, of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the beginnings of Jewish, we call Jewish scholarship, Jewish academic scholarship. And what you have before you are four of the important figures. They're not the only ones, but they're unquestionably, some of the great ones. Jost and Zunz show up at the University of Berlin in 1815. The university only opened in 1810, so they're relatively new students, they're fresh. And who is teaching at the University of Berlin? But De Wette was one of the really important scholars that I had up on the slide a minute ago. And, well, they're meeting him. They're taking courses with him. Jost had also actually earlier met Eichhorn. So that's it. This is now when you see Jews coming up close, reading the material, confronted with the material. There is no real way of getting around it. And they're individuals committed to scholarship, to Western German scholarship. So the question is to think about what they did and how they responded. So the first one just to consider is Jost. You look at the screen, you can actually also see that what he had intended to do here was write a history from the Maccabean, from the Hasmonean era onward. He wasn't going to treat the Bible, interestingly enough. Although in volume 3, which came out in 1822, he does double back, and now suddenly he does discuss the Bible. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but in any event, and what he does when he presents the Bible is use the fragmentary hypothesis, which was a kind of a reigning notion at the beginning of the 19th century, which is to say that a book like Genesis, for example, if I'm not mistaken, he had something like 37 identifiable fragments, which is not fragments in the, finding it in the, in some Geniza somewhere, but just saying that from a literary point of view, it looks like there's 39 discrete pieces which are ultimately woven together here. And then, and he defended this. So that is interesting. I will also point out, however, is that when he published a shorter version of this history in 1832, he suddenly backed off. And suddenly he's far more agnostic. He says, yeah, there's a critical view, and he sort of describes it as it is. And then he says, well, there's a traditional view, and that's it. He's not as certain or not identifying with it as much as he did in his earlier writings. It is possible. I don't really know this clearly, and it's something I certainly need to think about and check whether Hengstenberg and that kind of conservative reaction might not have had an effect here. I think that is a fair question. So he does that. Zunz, for his part, had written in his in 1832, excuse me, and his work on the history of the Jewish sermon had said something which ended up being quite important, which is that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei HaYamim, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Book of Chronicles, all had the same author. In other words, ultimately there was one book, and this was actually an important insight, and it was a book that was ultimately as late as the 4th or even early 3rd century BCE. Probably the most original and important work that came out of this foursome, at least, is Abraham Geiger's Urschrift. Again, a serious substantive work. I mean, there's no question about that, where, if I could say this sort of standing on one leg, he basically argued that the way in which, at some point, the ancient Israelites dealt with new challenges, new ideas, even new theological ideas, was to adopt the text. In other words, the text was far more fluid originally and allowed them, through various textual kinds of changes and emendations, to address certain issues that might arise. That didn't last, and ultimately the text kind of shut down. They returned it to what they felt was some original text, and then the Masoretic text was born. But he basically argued that there was this fluid period. Again, Geiger's really an excellent scholar and very creative, and very much in control of the sources that he had. So it's an impressive work. I return now just to say a few words about Heinrich Gretz. Gretz is well known, as all you know, as a historian. But Ismar Schorsch, a former chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary, I consider him a friend and as a wonderful, wonderful human being and an excellent scholar, wrote a piece just not that long ago, 2019, titled Gretz as a Biblical Critic. And what Schorsch points out is that for the last 20 years of Gretz's career, he didn't write history. He actually worked on the Bible. And he spent 20 years doing that. The first fruits of this were editions of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. That came; those were both published in 1871. Later, in 1882, he, I think it was a 2-volume work on Psalms. In each case, Gretz amended the text, and that's putting it nicely. Gretz essentially said, the Masoretic text is not authoritative. I will not take it as such. It needs serious, serious work and emendation, and he just goes at it. He also discussed books like Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs as being much later than tradition would normally date them. Ecclesiastes, 1st century BCE, that's really late, and the Song of Songs, 3rd century BCE. So this is, these are the important scholars. But I must say, and I want to really make this argument, it is true that, for example, Zunz and Geiger in the 1870s, give or take, late 60s, 70s, towards the end of their lives, they did turn to working on biblical scholarship. Again, in Gretz, I already mentioned. But I must tell you that when you stand back and ask yourself, what is the sum of what these great scholars did? Again, I want to pause and say, as scholars of rabbinic and medieval literature, the work they did is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, and used and really important. I mean, it shaped Jewish studies unquestionably. By comparison, when you look at the work on the Bible, it doesn't hold up. It's nowhere nearly as important, pushing the field forward. It's derivative. It's reactive. It simply doesn't matter. Now, I'm not the first one to say this, but I will also tell you very honestly, it's not entirely clear why. We could throw out a number of suppositions, ideas, but again, but I think the more important comment is simply to say, here we have the beginnings of Jewish studies. You have 4 really excellent scholars, some better, whatever it may be. And ultimately, they did not pick up the field. This just doesn't happen. There's something here. There is, I'll get to that in a minute. I'll tell you the one exception. But look, there are different ideas floated. Some point out, again, this is maybe reductive, but yes, they did focus on sort of post-biblical literature, mostly medieval literature. Yes, we said that before, but maybe that's the point. In other words, that they felt where they needed to adjust in the field, where the arguments they were making for political reasons, I'm sorry, I can't really get into that fully right now, was to claim for academia and for academic study how important it is to appreciate rabbinic and medieval literature. So that's where they threw their energies. I mean, speaks partly for itself. But there's possible political reasons. Either they didn't necessarily want to confront the Christian scholars, which ultimately it might have demanded if they took a different view. There's another idea, which is to say that had they really focused on biblical writings, it may have inadvertently done something they didn't want, which is to focus on what? On the Israelite attachment to land, nation and land, which is, of course, one of the things you get when you study scripture. It's just not clear. Again, the only honest thing I could say is that they did not accomplish that much, what I did want to say, just as now this goes back to my second talk, which is that there's an exception. And I think once you sort of realize, or if you accept my argument about Wissenschaft and sort of the lack of real attainment, and you actually look at what Kalish did in 1867, let's say in his Leviticus first volume, and then second volume was in 1872, you just realize it's night and day. What Kalish did was far, far, far ahead. I mean, it was really interesting, sophisticated work. But as I said in the second lecture, it went absolutely nowhere, had no impact, neither on the study of Bible on the continent, nor among Jews. Just that's it. And again, I won't really revisit that. But as we pick up the story, of course, we need to turn to a watershed moment, unquestionably for a number of reasons, and that is the work of Julius Wellhausen, Geschichte Israels, in 1878. The second edition, when it comes out in 1883, is now titled Prolegomena to the History of Israel. It's the same book, more or less. I mean, it's his ideas. It's a watershed moment because, of course, he established a regnant and influential theory of the documentary hypothesis. This is what Wellhausen is famous for. He pulled together many ideas that had been there and did something really important for the field, and certainly was, for decades after, really had great impact. But it was also a watershed moment for Jews, because what Wellhausen did was deeply troubling. It's not to say that the Protestant scholars before Wellhausen were writing with some kind of a philo-Semitic or a positive view of Jews. I'm certainly not claiming that. But with Wellhausen's work, and again, with Wellhausen, the issue is not just the documents, the four classical documents that he established, J, E, D, and P. It's not that. Wellhausen was a historian. He was a historian of religion, and he was a historian of ancient Israel. What he did was line up those sources to tell a particular story. And that particular story was not one that pleased any of the Jews of the era, for a very simple reason. First of all, he worked with a number of basic dichotomies: prophetic religion versus priestly religion, spiritual moral concerns versus concern for formal and fixed practices, even dry practices. And if you follow me, you could see where this is going. Basically, when Wellhausen put his sources and lined them up, the story of Israel ultimately was, well, first of all, it began with far more pagan roots than anyone would acknowledge. It doesn't really begin with monotheism, but you have the period of the prophets. You have the soaring spiritual, concerns, and a monotheism that emerges, and then it deteriorates into this priestly, picayune, obsessive, any negative word you could possibly think of, and that is the history of Israel, of course. Then comes Jesus, then comes Christianity, the whole, then comes salvation, if you will. I mean, this is, and Wellhausen, again, was profoundly influential. So what Jews saw was not just some kook or someone who's marginal, but rather, whoa, this is now making an impact and really confronted them in many ways. I'm going to move forward and then maybe back a little, but there's two other developments that happen. Now, they don't happen right when Wellhausen is writing. They happen right at the beginning of the 20th century. Number one, the Code of Hammurabi, it's 18th century BCE, but it's only rediscovered in 1901, published in 1902. And at the same time, something that's quite well known, at least among Bible scholars and also, historians, is a series of lectures by Friedrich Delitzsch, Babel und Bibel, where he essentially, the sum of the discovery of the Code of Hammurabi and these lectures was to argue that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was inferior to and derivative of Babylonian culture. When you have Hammurabi, you could say, well, we have a much older code. This actually includes much material which we could find in the book of Exodus. There are parallels there, but guess which one came first? And therefore, which is derivative of, A is derivative of B. And Delitzsch's lectures unquestionably argued that, again, anything good or positive or anything worthwhile in the Pentateuch could be shown to be derivative of Babylonian culture. So this was a way really of saying, well, anything claimed for this people, anything claimed for this tradition, really, it doesn't belong to it, to put it nicely. You could see how the Jews respond, and now suddenly the response is much more aggressive, and again, for reasons that I think should be evident from what I said. First of all, just a quote from 1888. This is a quote of Gretz writing on Wellhausen, and I'm quoting, "Wellhausen is a blunderer in the elementary facts of Hebrew." This tends to be an argument that Jews will make, and his criticism is largely influenced by his anti-Semitism, which he takes no pains to disguise. He vents his antipathy against the Jewish nose, his words, on Abraham, Moses, and Ezra. Ouch, is about right. But this is Gretz. The second figure here has a completely different tone, a completely different focus. This is Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who was director of the Orthodox Rabbiner Seminar in Berlin. Really a phenomenal scholar. And in a series of essays and then later commentaries, he sought to counter Wellhausen. And instead of just throwing invective, he actually did the difficult work. He, almost, verse by verse, section by section. That's, I think, the fair way to put this. But later when he wrote his commentary, it certainly was verse by verse, questioned the kind of reading that Wellhausen put forth, especially, and for those of you, again, who know a little bit in the field, the whole relationship of Leviticus to Deuteronomy, the relationship of the priestly writings versus the Deuteronomistic writings, where, again, Wellhausen put the P later, that the priestly writings came later. What Hoffman is doing, and really doing this with meticulous sort of care, is to show that it's simply wrong. That if you actually look at it on a verse-by-verse basis, you could question his assumptions and show that the story is actually different. So this is, again, a totally different kind of response. Again, how effective it was or not, well, that's a very good question. I will tell you, and again, this is no big surprise, that German Bible scholars, the Protestant Bible scholars, didn't necessarily drop everything they're doing just because Hoffman did what Hoffman did. Who did it convince? Well, I think he has a Jewish readership, which is clearly who he was writing for, and that's fair. That's who he was trying to address. But it's also sort of like when we step back and evaluate this, it is a narrow, you could say effective if you buy his arguments, but it's a narrow refutation of what Wellhausen was doing. In other words, it doesn't completely overturn the documentary hypothesis, the Gadol, as we would say, in terms of its big picture, because you could still date P before D. That's fine. You can make all kinds of arguments. Again, that doesn't really undermine, ultimately, some of the foundations or fundamental claims being made here. And last but not least, I turn to Solomon Schechter, who, even though at the point in which I'm going to quote him, he's already arrived in the United States, he's already the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. This is in 1903, but he's still very much a European scholar. So even though he's just landed, I think in all fairness, one should consider him as part of this. So I will quote him. The very famous banquet speech that he gave. Yes, a banquet speech. It was 1903. There was something called the Judean Society, and they were there to honor actually the president of the Hebrew Union College, which is interesting. It just shows that once upon a time, presidents of the Hebrew Union College and of JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, could could be very civil, could be very warm to one another, very cordial, and he did it. Later, Schechter's, much later, the speech was published with the title, Higher Criticism, Higher Anti-Semitism. And he became quite well known for this. Let me just give you a few quotes. I'm quoting now from Schechter. Higher anti-Semitism is partly, though not entirely, contemporaneous with the genesis of the so-called higher criticism of the Bible. Wellhausen's Prolegomena and History, two different books, are teeming with aperçus full of venom against Judaism. And then later on, this is now alluding to the discovery of the Code of Hammurabi and Delitzsch's lectures. This higher anti-Semitism has now reached its climax when every discovery of recent years is called to bear witness against us and to accuse us of spiritual larceny. We're basically being accused of being thieves. One last quote. Because ultimately, Schechter, and you'll see I'm trying to pivot this in a different direction, really have to think about, well, how are we supposed to respond? Fine, it's easy to say Wellhausen and all these others simply dislike the Jews. True, fine, fair enough. That doesn't really tell you, well, what should Jews be doing in response? So I quote, this is towards the end of his banquet speech. This intellectual persecution can only be fought by intellectual weapons. And unless we make an effort to recover our Bible and to think out our theology for ourselves, we are irrevocably lost. We have to create a living, great literature and do the same for the subjects of theology and the Bible that Europe has done for Jewish history and philology. This is, again, an important call. And the truth is, as president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, he was well positioned to actually do this. Except, this is a picture of the seminary, not its iconic building that still stands to this day, but an earlier building. But the question was, who are you going to hire? And that's not a joke here. That's actually a serious problem. So, Samuel Poznansky, one choice. Israel Friedlander, a second choice. Felix Perles. Poznansky was a medievalist. He worked, again, great scholar. Great scholar, was in Warsaw, wrote on the Karaites, found important medieval exegetical manuscripts. All that is very nice, but that doesn't make you a Bible scholar. It makes you a scholar of exegesis. Israel Friedlander, an Arabist. Yes, he had studied with Nildeke in Strasbourg. Nildeke had once been a Bible scholar, but had shifted and was now a great, one of the really great, important Arabists, and Friedlander was actually one of his top students. And the truth is they had an interesting relationship. I'll just digress just for a slight second. Israel Friedlander was actually a great Zionist. Nildeke thought this was nuts, that these Jews who believed in that, and if you look, I think it's in the Encyclopedia Britannica 1911, it's Nildeke who writes the entry on Hebrew. And it's Nildeke who says that those who are trying to revive the language, like they are trying to revive the nation, it's just dreams. It's nothing. It's worthless. In any event, now Perles is a bona fide Bible scholar. I might tell you later in the questions. I don't want to how I know that in fact Perles was offered a job by Schechter as well, because I think you're probably the first audience to hear this. This is a recent discovery. So these are the three possible candidates. And who does he hire? Well, Perles ends up, for whatever reason, not accepting or not being available. He has Friedlander, which is simply to say that the one you hire for Bible is not a Bible scholar. Friedlander ultimately does a couple of things in Bible, but you see, this is not simple. Where are you going to find a qualified candidate? This is the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. They want to hire people who certainly are literate Jews, meaning they are learned in rabbinic literature. They have a broad understanding. They certainly wanted someone who was at least fairly traditional in terms of personal practice. And the one who was available was Israel Friedlander. He arrives in 1903. But again, this doesn't go anywhere. And the truth is, for the seminary, ultimately, there wasn't really anyone to do Bible till much later. What Friedlander did do, and I'm not sure I'm going to quote this just in the interest of time, he may have made Schechter a little bit happy. Schechter was ultimately, I think, quite disappointed in some ways. Not that, like, he tried to sort of say, well, your job is conditional on, turning back to some of your biblical interests. It just never happened. But Friedlander did write a review of a book, a commentary to Psalms written by Charles Briggs. Now, for those of you who are Bible scholars or know or are interested, Briggs taught at the Union Theological Seminary, it's across the street now from the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's an important seminary. This is the same Briggs of the Brown Driver Briggs Biblical and Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon. So that's considered a sort of classic work. That's the same Briggs. And other things. Friedlander writes a review. This is published in the American Hebrew in July 1907. He just rips at Briggs. He just simply says this is a completely irresponsible book. And he does so very publicly. So again, but that again doesn't build a field. You could be very critical and say this is simply nonsense. It's unacceptable. But okay. Until now, in terms of where we've been in the talk, what I've tried to describe is something, again, I've said a couple of things. I've said that, these Jews are reactive. There is some creative scholarship, original scholarship. I would certainly say that Geiger's Urschrift is in there. Hoffmann's work, I think, is very important. It's certainly very deep and scholarly. But there's still a question of what are you going to do in any kind of positive way? Where are you going to build out, if you will, a field? And what I want to do to begin with is to sort of look at an internal Jewish discussion, which takes us back to Gretz. I remember I mentioned that Gretz published a version or an edition of Shir HaShirim, of the Song of Songs, where he was, again, incredibly critical when it came to the emendations and ultimately dated it much later. But then we step back now, so we're stepping back to 1871, and a very important Eastern European figure, we would call him an Eastern European maskil, of Enlightenment sort, who migrated to Vienna in 1867, 1868, and almost immediately began publishing this journal called Hashachar, which really was one of the very important 19th century Hebrew journals. So that suddenly we're looking at Hebrew literature, because everything I've mentioned so far was written in German. This is interesting. The early issues of Hashachar from 1868 to 1871 was actually somewhat open to the idea of textual criticism, the idea being that we will return scripture to its original luster, is sort of the way I would put it. And then comes Gretz's 1871 edition of the Song of Songs, and Smolenskin does not react well. The first quote here, and this will, I think, tell you a lot about where Smolenskin is in general, and I'll quote, "When the Gentile critics rose to examine scripture and ruined it on account of their failure to understand scripture properly, Jewish critics hurried to compete and do as they did. The art of ruining scripture thus became an honor and glory. And the more one ruins it, the more admirable he is, since this is what the Gentile scholars do." Okay, so this is Smolenskin. That's classic Smolenskin. As he sat in Vienna to see the assimilation, the cultural and intellectual and religious assimilation of Jews, drove him nuts. And again, it's very important. Smolenskin is not himself in any way, he's not representing tradition in a religious sense. That's not Smolenskin at all. But this kind of intellectual, cultural assimilation, he said, I'll just read you another good quote here. "Pilpul has not died to this day, but left behind the study houses of Poland and now made its way to Germany. It now shows its power not with matters of law and judgment, right? It's Talmudic kind of, but in biblical criticism. Yet the ways of Pilpul have not changed at all, and its potency remains that it always was, to build towers in the air, to take words of truth and beauty and make them worthless and dull. Gretz went beyond all his predecessors in his sharp and cutting Pilpul. He not only hung mountains on a hairbreadth, you'll all recognize these allusions, but also split the hair 100-fold and then hung 1,000 mountains on each, on each hair. And it goes on and on. I mean, he attacks this. One last point here. He says to the kind of scholars out there who sort of ask, well, what kind of literary form is the Song of Songs? How should I view it? And who try to fit it into some category of another. He says, what do you mean, to what literary form does it belong? It belongs to its own form. I'll quote, the Hebrew classification is no classification, since this is its way. This alone is its beauty. In other words, it's unique. Don't compare it to anything else. The poetic author of Song of Songs was not offering his listeners or readers a drama or epos, nor a love song in line with the canons of Greek poets, but rather a love song that was Jewish in the jumble of its canons and rules without any regimen. And this is its splendor. In other words, when you're looking at Shir Hashirim, you're looking at the Song of Songs, he's saying, do not treat the Bible as any other book. Do not treat it simply as a literary artifact. Respect and honor it for its uniqueness. But again, he's not saying this in religious terms. He's saying this very much in cultural terms. This book belongs to us. What he's saying to Gretz is, how dare you? How dare you? This is our neches. This is our treasure. And you have no right imitating the Gentiles in what you are doing. Now, I'm going to jump to another very important and interesting figure that I think you've all heard about. And this is now sort of, I'm going to do a little bit here of something that is really not that well known, but it's something that really needs to be appreciated. Chaim Nachman Bialik, great poet, essayist, translator, publisher, really just an absolutely incredible figure. For those of you who have not yet been to Beit Bialik in Tel Aviv, you should go. You should go because the permanent exhibit, first of all, it's a lovely place. And it sits in a lovely corner of Tel Aviv that even I admit I didn't really know about until I had to go to Beit Bialik. But what's incredible is that in their simple, small exhibit, you just see how multifaceted this man was. I had no idea. I really had no idea. You go out of there and your jaw just, wow, drops. Now, it's generally known that Bialik was the first translator, or the translator, sorry, of Shakespeare, Schiller, Heine, and others. He really did invest in translating. What is not generally known was that he also translated German biblical scholarship. In fact, as far as I could tell, he was the first translator of modern German biblical scholarship into Hebrew. He translated, and this appears in Warsaw in 1904, a book of Wilhelm Nowak, who was in Strasbourg, if I'm not mistaken, on biblical archaeology. So that's number one. That's 1904. I discovered, this is hot off the press, but in Beit Bialik are 12 Russian letters. I do not read Russian, but I had a Russian graduate student. I scanned it, and she went over these letters. So a dozen letters from Max Soloveitchik, we'll talk about in a moment, to Bialik from 1912, where it's clear, again, the letters are all in one direction. It's Soloveitchik writing to Bialik. And they're preparing a guide to biblical scholarship modeled on sort of the standard German Handbuch, meaning they had these sort of, guide twos, and now they were preparing one in Hebrew. It's very clear here that even though this is Soloveitchik who's preparing this, that Bialik would be the publisher and that Bialik was the guide. I mean, he kept, turning to him for advice and guidance and etc. So that is, again, this is something that we just found. This isn't Beit Bialik. The letters had never been cataloged. Again, I have to thank Yehudit Danon, who's the archivist there, who drew my attention to this. Interestingly, in Hebrew, the title was going to be Otzar Lecheker Kitvei HaKodesh, Holy Scriptures. Don't let that fool you, though, because there's no question that this was going to be a guide or a handbook that was taking a critical view, or at least absolutely open to a critical view. And I could show that in any number of ways from what we found in those letters. I want to continue. What is also not well known is that Bialik, who was the publisher of Dvir, first Moria, then Dvir. Dvir is a well-known, very important Hebrew publisher. That was Bialik. It still exists, but it's been bought out by other publishers. But around 1924, Bialik conceived of a sub-imprint, if you will, or an imprint of Dvir called Dvir Mikra. Dvir specializing in biblical literature. They had great plans. Bialik, by the way, it's the other thing. If you go to Bialik had 1 million plans. And I could show you that most of the plans he had never came to anything. What's incredible here is how much he did actually accomplish in his life. But lots of projects fell by the wayside. And this Dvir Mikra, this Dvir Bible imprint, only came out with 2 books. One of them is this, which is a book by Menachem Soloveitchik, Max, as he went, and Zalman Rubashev. And I don't know if you all recognize the name Zalman Rubashev, Zalman Shazar, the 3rd president of the state of Israel, who at one point in his life did something important. Then he became the president. The important thing is that he published this book with Soloveitchik, and it's a remarkable book. It is a history of biblical criticism, of biblical scholarship. And it's not just a dispassionate one. It's obvious what these guys are trying to do. They're claiming that if you want to see the beginnings of biblical critical scholarship, look at the Talmud. It's there. They're already asking good questions. Spinoza gets a whole chapter. Okay, so obviously I'm taking issue with them. That's fine. I think I'm allowed in terms of my argument about Spinoza, and on and on. And I'm going to read to you, if I may, the last paragraph, last even sentences of this history of biblical scholarship. The plow has tilled the forsaken field, meaning critical biblical study, and the first new buds of this early century have appeared. With much hesitation and measured steps, and belatedly, Jewish critical thought is coming into its own. Well, this is what they're trying to promote. So this is, and who knows, maybe gates that have been locked until now will open up in the future, when the master himself, in Hebrew, Bal Habira, will knock on their door. Now, the Bal Habira in Midrashic literature is God. When you read it in this context, and you read it again and you read it again, you realize that's not what they mean. The master of the literature here, who's the master of the literature? Am Yisrael, the Jews. We are the masters of this literature. This literature belongs to us. So they've done something remarkable here. We're saying, finally, we're beginning to knock on the door of critical scholarship. Again, this is how they end their book. Again, this is published by Bialik. And that's actually the, I said there were 2 books that were published, but one of the books, the other one, on the very back page, you do what publishers do, right? You announce future publications. And that is the page right there. When you look at it, on top is this Toldot Bikorat HaMikra. I'm going to translate what's relevant here. Underneath it is another book called Torat, meaning sort of the principles or the methods or the teachings of, methods is probably how we would say it, of Bikorat HaMikra. That exists in the Genazim archive, which is in Beit Ariella in Tel Aviv. I found actually the sort of manuscripts versions. And then on the bottom, this is, again, Bialik announcing that they will publish Hebrew translations of leading German Protestant critical scholarship. And he mentions 2 books. I don't have to get into the detail. But the 3rd book, and I'm going to now, and thank you, Natasha. I'm going to now translate and read that for you. The 3rd book says, we're preparing a Hebrew translation of Wellhausen's Prolegomena. And I'm going to read you the translation of that paragraph there. The name of this author, Wellhausen, is well enough known to anyone who deals with or is interested in the examination of Holy Scriptures and the history of ancient Israel. Many praise it and many deprecate it. There's a nice, beautiful play on the Hebrew, because the Shorashim, the root is Mehalel and Mechalel. Many praise it, many deprecate it. But very few Hebrew speakers have actually read it. His central book will be presented in Hebrew, faithful to the original. Anyone who wants to really understand the author, who built the foundation for examining the Bible and nudged it in a new direction that continues to influence biblical scholars, can then come and read it carefully. So far, pretty neutral. Look, you need to be educated. No one reads this. Here it is. And they're working on it. The last line is remarkable. I translate again, I read. The author's scholarly teachings are conveyed in a superb literary style, Wellhausen. And with this translation, one of the most exceptional pieces of scholarly literature enters the treasury of Hebrew humanistic writings. Chaim Nachman Bialik. This is extraordinary. I didn't believe this when I rubbed my eyes and I read it a few times. This is really extraordinary. Okay. This is 1925, and I'm going to move to something else that also happens in 1925, the establishment of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, a half a year before that, the Institute for Jewish Studies had already been set up, and starting already basically in early 1923, a committee, which was located in London, chaired by Joseph Hertz, Rabbi Hertz, and an international group, started setting up this Institute for Jewish Studies. So again, the debates go on 1923, 1924. Okay? Among the millions of issues that they had, and again, this is short of time, so I'm not going to get into that, was who are we going to hire in Bible? One group said it would be scandalous to have a critical scholar. The other group said it would be scandalous to have a traditional scholar. We're either a self-respecting university or we're not. These are difficult issues. They really are difficult issues. Some, by the way, had a brilliant idea. One of each. They did. They really floated that as a possibility. There was other, again, and maybe in the questions we could. But again, there was a real problem here, which was a problem of like litmus testing. We're not going to hire someone and like check their tzitzis, as we would jokingly say. And, you know, what are we going to do? Give them a questionnaire? Are you an apikoros? You know, how much of an apikoros are you? Well, you know, but it's, again, they really, you have to appreciate the hand-wringing here. Well, in 1925, they hired this fellow, Moshe Tzvi Segal, to teach Mishnaic Hebrew. They didn't want to hire him for Bible. They were still debating. But because he had studied at Oxford with Driver and Cheney, spent 15 years as a rabbi, as a minister actually, in the United Synagogue. He had, you know, he wasn't young when he came to this new Hebrew University. He was married to a Frumkin, meaning he had sort of good Palestinian Zionist roots. And they asked him to head a committee on the Tanakh. That was what it was called, a committee basically to sort of, you know, of the scholars who were in Jerusalem at the time to come up with a proposal. And he, in fact, does. This next text I found in the archives of the Hebrew University. I must say, Sarah Yafet and others, great scholars were looking for this text. I'm not sure why they didn't see it. It was in a different file, but doesn't matter. I think it normally would have been found. I found it. Just again, not that long ago. It is an 8-page proposal. 8-page proposal, and again, it's worth sort of considering it. Well, he does a number of things. I mean, what he says here, I've got to summarize, but I'm not going to have time to quote, is that first of all, when we think of the field of Bible, it has become almost entirely the province of non-Jews. Come on, folks. It's 1925. This field is mostly dominated. We can't allow that. We're establishing a new Institute for Jewish Studies. We must change that. He has this great line. We were largely compelled, because all the great scholars in the field are Christians, we are largely compelled to wallow at the feet of Christian teachers and to accept the fruits of their research. This simply can't be. So on the one hand, in this sort of 8-page proposal, he says, look, we must embrace, and I'm quoting, pure scholarship and critical freedom without any limitations and without particular interests and predispositions. We're a university. We're going to be, right? It's not a university yet. We have to have unfettered. But as his proposal goes, you suddenly see how he's grappling with the obvious question, right? There are people out there with sensitivities. What are we going to do? What kind of faculty are we looking for? Here, I'm going to read this to you. The only way to obtain the desired end is to appoint teachers who drew most of their understanding of the Bible and its origins not from Wellhausen, Kunin, and Marti, but from Talmudic sages and our masters Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Radak, individuals who, besides their greatness in their particular fields of Bible, also studied and delved into and pondered all the fields of our classical literature. Such individuals would know and understand the responsibility vested upon them and appreciate the trust given them in their work. they would certainly make an effort to fulfill their obligations to scholarship and to the Torah and Jewish beliefs. He's trying to somehow find a way to thread this difficult choice. And ultimately, again, this is so interesting, he says, look, all we can do ultimately is, it is therefore fitting that the appointment of teachers should consider the different leanings prevalent among Jews today. Well, obviously, there's a whole spectrum. It's 1925. And that in conjunction with these leanings, teachers with different worldviews would be appointed, but with the proviso that they possess complete academic erudition and affection for that which is sacred to the Jews. In other words, he says we need academic freedom, but, and this is exactly it, this is hand-wringing. One of the scholars that he mentions at the end of his proposal, he has a very nice list, and it's a good list, is Felix Perlis, who Schechner tried to hire some decades ago. Okay, I think I still have 5 minutes, or, okay. So Perlis was born in Munich, studied in Munich, Vienna, Paris. In 1899, he was appointed deputy rabbi in Königsberg in East Prussia. He came out with it's an important, respected work, 1895, and then the second volume much later in 1922, Analecton, which has extensive emendations of the Masoretic text. But he works in a very methodical way. He has, he puts out a categorization of all kinds of errors that copyists would normally make. It's actually something that's still viewed as very useful. He doesn't attack Wellhausen, this Perlis. Rather, he uses the 7th edition, 1914 edition of Wellhausen to say, and I quote, instead of ignoring or rejecting all results of criticism, Jewish scholars must participate independently in critical work. Don't just criticize. Do it. Do it in some independent fashion, but do it. The Institute for Jewish Studies in September 1926 offers him the position. So finally, you have a bona fide Bible scholar. I should tell you already, it was a hire for the spring of 1927. And he came around Passover and taught the spring semester. But before he showed up in February, he already had announced that he's only coming for the semester. He is not going to take the position, which bummed everyone out, if I may use that language. Everyone finally thought that we had a solution. We actually had someone. Well, didn't work out. Okay, I'm just going to give you some quotes from Perlis, and then we will try to draw this to some kind of an end. First of all, he stands up and he gives a special lecture. Not only does he give the course, and that is what you see on the right, Mahu lanu Madha HaMikra. It's actually a very difficult title to translate, if you want to capture, especially with the question mark at the end. Either you can have it as, what does biblical scholarship mean to us, or should it mean to us, or why should biblical scholarship matter to us? This is an open public lecture, like this one, given in there on Mount Scopus in 1927. So first of all, he argues, look, biblical scholarship has advanced. He has great respect for the medieval exegetes, but now we know all the Semitic languages. And he sort of lists them and he says, look, unquestionably, this should change our understanding of the Hebrew text. What is the difference, he asks, between scholarly study and criticism? He says, criticism does not suffice with clarifying what is before us now, but tries to arrive at the source. Criticism asks, when and by whom were the biblical books written? Are our copies identical with those penned by their authors? Are there deletions and additions? Have they been compiled from different sources, etc., etc.? Okay? In other words, he is a text critic, but he's clearly trying to broaden this out. He says, look, it's well known that Bible critics often contradict one another. That often is an argument used against them. Well, they can't agree on anything. What use is this field? And essentially, he says, but one should not conclude that all they say is absurd. That is the wrong conclusion to draw. There are methods here, and there are things that they do agree on, so don't use that as a kind of counter argument. He too, like Segal before him, complains bitterly. Important works written on the Bible are being done by Christian scholars who have devoted all their energy to preserve our own very vineyard, our vineyard, while Jewish scholars stood afar without paying any attention. Again, it's a plea, it's a cry. He says, look, we have no choice. We have no choice. We can no longer ignore the scientific scholarly study of the Bible. We need to choose between a scholarship that is filled with a foreign spirit and one that is filled with the Holy Spirit. Biblical scholarship can and must create something new in our nation. Just as members of our nation are today, 1927, working their ancestors' land and extracting new fruit, and he means this literally, and he's talking, of course, about the chalutzim, so the spiritual workers among us must work the field that is the source of all the greatness of Israel, in which rests the roots of our eternal strength. We are now standing, says Rabbi Dr. Perlis, we are now standing at Mount Scopus, which is higher than anything around it and offers an unlimited view. Now he's going to wax really poetic. We must similarly hope that the eyes of the nation will also open with respect to biblical scholarship, that all the doubts will be allayed. And his ending is masterful. It is my hope that the ancient prophecy, Torah shall come forth from Zion, will come true in a new sense. Everyone loves to use this, by the way. I can show you many, many other examples of those who use it exactly for this kind of reason. Just as the Torah went forth from Israel long ago, so may it be for the future. May the understanding of the Bible come forth from this Institute of Jewish Studies, to illuminate all the world's inhabitants with the light of this scholarship. This was Perlis's fervent plea and request. By the way, the Institute of Jewish Studies is about to turn 100, literally, in December, exactly 100. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. As I said in my opening remarks, this is a very partial picture, and it really is. Even in the timeline that I covered, meaning, from Mendelssohn up to about 1927, I've skipped figures like Beno Yaakov, Ehrlich, Wiener, Mosenson, Hershenson, all kinds of really important and entirely different lines of scholarship, like archaeology. Okay, I'm confessing my sins. There's much here that simply couldn't be fit in. And of course, what I didn't deal with is the last 100 years, everything from 1924, 25, 27, whatever, where again, the story has unfolded both in the North American context, Canada, and of course, the United States, and in what was once Palestine, and then, pre-state, and then the state of Israel as well. But that is a different story for another time. So thank you.